Hi there, in today's demonstration I want to show you how I built a Power Virtual Agent chatbot to interact with the DHL Parcel API. So the idea of the solution is to demonstrate how to use Power Automate to query data from an external data source, which could in fact be SharePoint or Dataverse, but in my case is an external API. Gather data from that API and return it back to the chatbot based on the interaction with the end user. So if that's something that interests you, please watch on, and without further ado, let's jump into the demonstration. So to get this demonstration started, you'll note that I'm currently on my blog at demobird365.com, and I've actually embedded the Power Virtual Agent onto my page using the sample code from the Power Virtual Agent platform. And it's here that I can start a conversation with my DHL bot. So I'm going to ask it, where is my parcel? So in return, I'll trigger the beginning of the conversation, and you can see that it's currently asking me for a tracking reference. So I have a tracking reference from earlier, which I'll copy and paste there into the chatbot, and we'll send that away, which will then in turn trigger a Power Automate Cloud Flow. And we can see that we have now the results of our parcel search. So my particular parcel was one that was delivered prior to Christmas on the 20th of December, and we can see that it was successfully delivered, but we've also got all of the individual events relating to the history of that parcel, all returned via the API and nicely formatted on screen. Now, if we have a look at that same parcel reference on the DHL website, we have exactly the same information. We can see that it was signed for by Bird on the 20th of December, and we have that parcel journey below. Now, in my particular case, I'm actually using the full-fat Power Virtual Agents, which will require licensing. And the reason I've gone down that route is because using a premium action, such as the HTTP action that I require in order to trigger the DHL API, requires premium licensing. There is a free version. If you've got access to Teams, you can build a Teams virtual chatbot, but in doing so, you are limited to using the standard connectors for Power Automate. And so the details around licensing are all available in this document, which I'll make available in the description below. So here I am in Power Virtual Agents, and earlier today I commissioned a chatbot called the DHL Bot, and I'm now looking at the topic screen. Again, earlier today, I defined a parcel tracking topic, and if I go ahead and click on that, you can see that the trigger phrases I've created relate to either DHL, parcel, or tracking, and that'll allow this particular conversation thread to play out if the bot recognizes what the end user is looking to discuss. So if we now jump into the authoring canvas, it's here where all the logic plays out with the conversation. And you'll note that our trigger phrases are at the top, followed by the first message that's sent to the end user once that particular topic has been triggered. And then I start with a question. Please provide me with your tracking reference. So at the moment, I'm relying on the user providing the tracking reference and the tracking reference only. And it's here that I could create a bespoke entity that would allow me to detect a string relating to that tracking reference. But for the purpose of today's demonstration, I've gone with the out of the box, assumed the full response from the end user will be the tracking reference and the tracking reference only. We'll take that response, and what we'll do is we'll save it into a variable, and you'll notice that I've called that variable the tracking ref. I then use that variable for my next action, which is going to trigger my Power Automate Cloud Flow. Now I will go into that Cloud Flow in more detail, but I'll quickly run through the rest of our process. So you'll note that I take that particular variable and I pass that to an input variable on our Cloud Flow, also called tracking reference or tracking ref. And then in return, that Cloud Flow will give us both the status, which is the current status of our parcel via the API, and also the events, which is a table of all the events for that parcel to date. So we saw on the demo on my website where it returned the multiple stages of the delivery. That is the output table for events. And so once that information has been returned by the flow, it will also be saved into variables, which we defined here as status and events, and we can present that in a message that's returned back to our end user. So here are the results of your parcel search, and we'll have both the status and the events table returned to our end user. Now it's here that I've got some logic that branches either to the left if the status is equal to no match found, or to the right, which is the ideal scenario where there has been a correct match. And you can see that all the way to the bottom, this particular action drops down to the end of the conversation. Now, if we follow the left-hand side, it's slightly more complicated in that we've not got a match. So we then ask the end user another question. Would they like to search again? Yes or no? Now we save that response into another variable. Search again is the variable name that I've gone for on this occasion. And you can see that I have another condition which is checking to see does the search again response equal to yes, in which case the logic will move all the way back up to the top of our process map here and trigger the question again. Please provide me with your tracking reference, and we'll continue back through the process. Now if the end user has selected no, we'll go down to the final action, which is to end the conversation. So now that we've covered the logic of our authoring canvas, let's go ahead and look at our Power Automate Cloud Flow. So let's now go and explore how that flow works. And we'll do that by launching our Flow Designer via this Flow Details button. And that will launch Power Automate and allow us to see the history of our flow to date. So I'll go into Edit, and then we'll explore the trigger and the various actions that I've used to build this solution. And you can see there's a standard trigger here for Power Virtual Agents, but note that I have an input variable of tracking ref. So this allows the Power Virtual Agent solution to supply the tracking reference that the end user has supplied to the chatbot into our Power Automate solution, because this is a key part of the solution and allows us to provide that onto the API for DHL. I then built out the rest of the solution in a scope. And the reason for me doing that is earlier on when I was building this as a solution, I did a lot of the building in traditional Power Automate, and that allowed me to build the flow prior to involving Power Virtual Agent and having to instigate a conversation. So that allowed me to do a lot of the testing outside of Power Virtual Agents, and then once I was ready, I could simply copy the scope using the copy to my clipboard and then paste that into my new flow using the Power Virtual Agents interface. So the first thing that I have at the top of my solution is an API key, and that's part of the DHL API. And so when I registered with the DHL API, you'll see that as well as the various documents and details, again, which I'll drop into the description, I needed to supply an API key. And that came as a result of me signing up for a developer's environment and then creating a new registration. So I have saved that particular key into a compose action, and you'll note the padlock, which means that I have enabled secure inputs, which is part of the settings. And the reason that I've done that is because it will mask out this API key in any future history runs and just keep things a little more secure. Now, if we have a look at the HTTP action, I have supplied the method, which is get, and then the URI, which is all based on the information in the DHL API. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, we need to use that tracking reference. So I've simply provided that using the dynamic value to our endpoint that we've got here. Now you'll note that I have a header, which is based on the spec from DHL, which includes the DHL API key as a key, and then the value being that of the output from the compose that we have here. And that enables us to do a search of the DHL API and return all the details for our parcel. So once that particular action is complete, I then run a condition. And that condition is checking a shipments array. And it's checking to make sure that it's not equal to null, because if it's equal to null, it means that we've got no response back from the API. And for me, it was the easiest way, a one-purpose catch-all. If there's nothing in that array, if it's returned nothing, then we can branch down the right-hand side here and return a default response, which you may recall earlier, no match found. And I will then give the end user, instead of a detail of all the events, a message to say, please track your your DHL tracking reference of, again using the dynamic value, and try again. And that allows us to terminate our flow if there's no match on that parcel. Now, all being well, we'll branch off down the left-hand side. I have got a compose in here just to say we've got a match. And my reasoning for doing that is, rather than trying to cram the rest of the logic all into this small little box, I've put a simple compose in there, which will cost me one API call, but it allows me to continue the rest of the flow in a slightly larger development area. And it makes it a lot easier for me to see, both when building and during the history, what happens next, because we know that this branch here will terminate and end the flow if there's no match found. So the next part of my flow really is to build out the body of the status and also the body of the events that we use for providing back to the end user. Now, when I looked at the API details on the DHL website, the information regarding the response was pretty sketchy. So it's here that I had to get my JSON hat on and start working out what the format of the data was. Now, when I deal with JSON, I tend to build out my expressions myself, and I do that by using a JSON beautifier because that allows me to visualize the structure of the data. You could argue that you could use the parse JSON action as part of Power Automate, which will allow you to query that data dynamically. But I'm going to quickly show you how I've understood the structure of this data in order to create the expressions that you currently see here in the notes. So jumping over onto the JSON beautifier, I have grabbed the output or the body from my HTTP call from earlier, and I've pasted it into this JSON beautifier, and you can see here that I have it on the right hand side viewed as a tree. And that allows me to see that I have a shipments array, and within that shipments array I have a single object. And then within that single object we have both a status object which contains the timestamp and description, which I'm going to use in my solution, but also an events array, which in this case has 7 or 8 further objects that contain timestamps, descriptions, and if I have a look at others, even locations and addresses. And it's this structure that allows you to build out and understand the expressions that are required in order to query this data. So when looking at this tree, it's useful to note that arrays will be contained within square brackets and objects are in these squigglies that I like to call them. So the first two expressions that I have in my Power Automate solution are for the status object that we can see here, which is based on the shipments array and the status object, and then the events array, which is based on the shipments array into our events array. So if we jump back onto Power Automate, you'll notice here that from the body of our shipments array, I'm having to get the first object, which is why I have the 0 here in square brackets. If you've seen this before, you could of course use the first expression, and then I'm simply returning the status object with this expression value here. Similarly for our events array, again, we start with the same expression. We're looking to get the first object from our shipments array here, and in this occasion we're returning the events array. So that'll give us both the object for status and the array for events here in two separate compose actions. And it's then afterwards that I have this fancy looking formatting going on. And you'll note that I'm using pipe delimiters in order to create columns, which is part of Markdown formatting. So Markdown formatting is required for Power Virtual Agents, and there is actually a separate document from Microsoft, again, which I'll supply in the description, that shows you how to format data in tables. And it's here that you can see a demonstration of these pipe delimiters, our headings, and the cells that are contained within each of those columns. So I've implemented this formatting that's provided here in order to provide a neat output on our Power Virtual Agent. So jumping back onto our Power Automate flow, you'll see here that I've implemented that formatting here for our first table, which is simply to provide the response from the status, which is a single line, which includes a timestamp, the status, and the description. And if we quickly jump back onto my original website and just scroll up here, you can see that we have the timestamp, status and description, followed by the time, the delivered, and the successful delivery description. Underneath that, we have our table that contains all the events. And jumping back onto Power Automate, this is where I've got two methods of achieving the same thing. And I thought it was an interesting thing to demonstrate, because the natural method, or the default method even, is to use an apply to each. And with an apply to each, you would take the output from the events array and grab each of those rows of data. And you'll see here that I have, again, the timestamp, the description, and in this case, the location and the address locality, all supplied as part of this string that I'm created within this compose action. Now, by using an apply to each, I can then use a method which I've demonstrated previously in some of my videos, where we use the outputs. And by calling outputs of the name of the compose action above, we can then create an array of all the values from our compose actions in the apply to each. Now, that's involved an apply to each, a compose action, and a separate compose action in order to create an array of these lines that we're looking for. But I've done exactly the same thing using a single select action. And the way that the select action works is we're using concat in order to bring together, again, the same values that you see here, the pipe delimiters, the expressions for format, date, time, which involves the timestamp, we have the description and the location of the address. And all of these are contained within this single concatenation as part of the map. Now, in order to achieve that, you must turn on the text value of select. I'm using exactly the same values for the from, which is our events array, but by using this concatenation, I'll get 8 single objects as strings, which will contain all those values in an array. So the next action is, as it sounds, a return line. I've simply put in my cursor into compose and hit the return on my keyboard. And the reason that I've done that is within my next action, I'm going to join all that information together using the return line. So if you think about it, we have an array containing all those rows of data, and we're going to join that to form a string using a return line as the value to return or join all those values together. You'll also notice again that I have this header which is based on the timestamp, the description and the locality, and that gives us our second table, which we can see is in the following format with all the event details nicely summarized. The final part of the solution is purely to return those values as these variables known as status and events, using the output from either the Markdown for Chatbot status or the Markdown for Chatbot events. And we can see that if we jump back onto the Power Virtual Agents interface, that these are the values that we use here and then subsequently supply to the message response that we give to our end user. So now that we've looked at our Power Automate flow, I thought it'd be useful to explore what happens when we're using the test bot and how that interacts with our process here, and also look at some of the run history of Power Automate. So if I trigger a new conversation here and ask it to track my parcel, we can actually watch the playback of our conversation and see that the chatbot has now recognized our trigger word and has asked us to provide a tracking reference as marked by the tick progress through our process here. I'm going to go ahead and provide an invalid tracking reference, and then we'll go ahead and look at the run history of Power Automate. So you'll see here that we've ended up returning no match found, and we're asking the end user would they like to search again. So here we are in the flow history, and you can see if we look at the trigger that our tracking reference was provided as 123. Now if I expand the scope, we can see that the HTTP action is actually failed. And one of the things that I failed to mention is that for our condition here, I've actually configured the run after to include on failure and on success. I was considering handling the individual status messages that are returned by this HTTP trigger action, but I thought for the purpose of this demonstration it would be easier to have the next action run if the HTTP trigger was successful or indeed not. So if we look at the condition, we can see that we've branched down the right hand side, and the reason for that is of course that in the body here we've not returned our array of details that we're looking for. So our condition was based on that value being not equal to null, which would have gone down the left. Of course it is null, so we're going down the right, and we simply return back to the Power Virtual Agent that no match was found and to check your DHL tracking reference. So absolutely no more of our flow is run, as you can see by the crosses here, and we've terminated the flow as successful. Now if we continue where we left off on our Power Virtual Agent test bot here, we can answer the question, would we like to search again, with a yes, and that will play out the condition logic, which then allows the chatbot to return back up to the top of our process here and ask the question again for a valid tracking reference. So it just so happens when I was testing earlier, I actually guessed a freak tracking code, and I'm going to go ahead and paste that in for a parcel that was posted in Australia. And we'll play that out and see what information we get back. So you can see on this case, we have a parcel that was delivered back on the 30th of November. And again, we can see the details and the events that resulted in that parcel being delivered. So it started off in Hong Kong, into Singapore, into Australia, and finally meeting its destination. Now the formatting is not so great here on the test bot, but that's purely because we're working within a smaller window. Of course, if I had it embedded on my website or a SharePoint site, we'll be able to expand the size of this window to suit the width appropriately. Now that conversation has found a parcel, we can answer it with a yes, and we can see again the process playing out all the way to the bottom and ending our conversation with our question regarding our rating. And so that marks the end of my demonstration. Now, in my scenario, I did use an HTTP trigger. You could, of course, be querying data from SharePoint or Dataverse. The solution is very much the same idea. You implement an action, which if we scroll up to the top here, it involves Power Automate. You need to be considering your input variables and also your output variables. You supply your input variable to your Power Automate flow as part of that trigger action, and then you provide your outputs as part of the final action within your Power Automate flow. So I hope that was of use to you. If there's any questions regarding the solution, please get in contact. And as always, if you've not subscribed, please make sure you do so, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Thanks very much for watching. Cheers.